The United States has ruled that juveniles may not be sentenced to life without parole for crimes other than homicide. But such youngsters, including some who have demonstrated complete rehabilitation, are still, in many cases, serving egregiously long sentences, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, or more. My guest this week is Nadine Pequeneza, the producer and director of a powerful new documentary about one youngster caught up in just such a nightmare. We're also joined by Mishi Faruqee, a juvenile justice expert at the American Civil Liberties Union. Welcome, and thanks so much for coming in. It's great to see you.
Thanks, Bob.
Nadine, your documentary, which will be shown on PBS's POV series, is called 15 to Life, Kenneth's Story. Tell us about it.
Well, it's a documentary about a 14-year-old who is recruited by his mother's drug dealer to rob hotels. And so over the span of 30 days, Kenneth Young robbed 4 hotels and was convicted of those robberies and sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences without parole. This happened in Tampa, Florida. But the documentary is really about a chance for redemption for Kenneth. Because of these U.S. Supreme Court decisions, his sentence was declared illegal, and so he was given an opportunity for a resentencing and a chance to show that he was rehabilitated.
When we first see Kenneth in the documentary, he's now in his mid-20s, I guess.
26.
And he's in a prison jumpsuit. He's shackled, and he has a mouthful of gold teeth. So the first impression is not a great one for the viewer. What were the conditions under which you first saw him, and what was your initial reaction?
I first saw him when he was in his in the jail where they were holding him, awaiting his resentencing. I had obviously read all of the original trial transcripts, so I had a sense of who Kenneth was. I'd interviewed his mother, I'd met his former teacher, his cousin, so I had a sense of who he was as a child. So I have to say that his appearance didn't
You weren't thrown by it at all?
I wasn't thrown by it, and Kenneth's demeanor does not match his appearance. And when you talk to him, you don't feel threatened or intimidated. He's really a very down-to-earth and sensible person, and he has a lot of perspective that he didn't have 11 years ago.
Now, as you make clear in the film, he's been a model prisoner. Mm-hmm. He has served 11 years, is that correct?
He served 11 and a half years at the time that the resentencing occurred. Now it's 3 years later.
And he's only had one infraction, one prison infraction in that entire time, and if I understand it correctly, that was for not making his bed on a Saturday morning. So this guy has not been in trouble in more than a decade. But nevertheless, since the law has been changed and Florida has to resentence him, the state wanted him, I guess, to serve initially a sentence of 40 years. Why do you think they wanted such a harsh sentence for a guy who's been a model prisoner and who committed crimes in which no one was harmed? Physically, is that correct?
No one was sent to hospital. I mean, the victims were, many of them reported being pushed onto the ground, kicked. So there was violence.
So there was physical assault.
There was violence, yes. Kenneth claims that it wasn't him who was doing that, and most of the victims reported that it was Jacques Bethea, the older defendant, who was responsible for those actions. But back to your question, why did the state want 40 years? When they were in the court, they actually justified that by reading into evidence information about predicted life expectancies of African American males. Because the Graham decision, this U.S. Supreme Court decision, said you cannot give a life sentence, so they wanted to be just shy of a life sentence.
So as close to a life sentence as possible.
Yes.
Mishi, let's be clear about what the rules are in these criminal sentences for juveniles, because there are a lot of young people who are serving very long sentences. Now, until 2005 in the U.S., you could actually sentence juveniles, people who had committed crimes, homicide as juveniles, to death. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, then that was overturned.
Right, so with the Roper v. Simmons, the Supreme Court decision banned the use of the juvenile death penalty.
So for homicide, what's the harshest sentence a juvenile can get?
So for homicide, a juvenile can still get a life sentence without parole, but it cannot be, after the Miller decision, it can't be a mandatory sentence. And so the judge has to take into consideration mitigating circumstances, but a judge can still sentence a young person to life without parole. A young person is, young as, in Kenneth's case, you saw, a young person who was 14 when some of the crimes were committed. And so there's still and the United States is really the only place in the world where you see these kind of harsh sentences for young people.
In Kenneth's case, he did not commit,
Right.
No one was killed
Right,
in
that's
these
right.
crimes. If someone were to be sentenced for a similar crime now, what's the harshest punishment that person could get now?
That's a really good question. States after the Supreme Court decision that was talked about in the film, the Graham decision, the courts can't sentence a young person for a non-homicide case to life in prison without parole, but they can still sentence a young person to basically natural life, and that's what you see where young people can get sentenced to 50 to life, 60 to life, and now, as states are trying to comply with the Supreme Court decisions, this is coming up more and more. Is how long is too long for young people? And I think when somebody is 14 or 15, even a sentence of 20 years seems like an eternity.
Right.
And young people are still developing at this age. So they're who you are at 14 is could be completely different than who you are at 25 or 30. And so it's a really difficult question in terms of what is an appropriate sentence for a young person. But if you compare the U.S. to the rest of the world, you never see these type of long sentences, particularly for people under 18.
Right. Some of these crimes are terrible crimes, violent assaults, rape, that sort of thing. Proponents of these extreme sentences would say, all right, so they were teenagers when the crimes were committed, but they did do these things, so why not lock them up for most of their life or for all of their life, and at least they won't commit these crimes outside the prison walls again. What's your reaction to that argument?
That is a large part of the thinking, and even statistically, people have looked at once offenders pass a certain age, they're less likely to reoffend. Usually they think they age out at around 30, and I think that is the predominant thinking. But if given the opportunity, because children aren't fully formed, if they have the right programs in place, if they have the right incentives, like they might be able to come out and reintegrate into society, actually have a career and a family, there can be great changes made and advances and opportunities for those kids, not just for themselves, but also to repay society for the debts that they have, to try and right the wrongs that they did. And in places like Missouri, where they do have very progressive programs for juveniles and one of the lowest recidivism rates in the country, these programs are working. So the idea of keeping someone in prison so that they don't reoffend, I mean, safety is one of the reasons we have prisons. So I understand that argument, but if there is the potential to rehabilitate and have someone reintegrate with society and contribute, then it would seem to me that would be the more beneficial choice.
Right. Now, Kenneth committed his crimes in the company, as you mentioned, of an adult, a seemingly hardened criminal named Jacques Bethea. And here's a clip about that from the documentary.
It was very violent. Over the counter, very vocal, in your face, guns to the head, putting people down on the ground. Our victims told us in all of these robberies that the most vocal one was Bethea. He was the older of the two. He was the one with the firearm. I'm not sure if Kenneth Young knew the consequences, quite frankly, at the time. But at that age, they really don't.
This is a common scenario, isn't it? The idea of teenagers, young people actually being drawn into criminal activity by adults. Mishi, is that pretty common?
That is very common. So when you, almost in every case where you see a young person being convicted of a serious crime, it's usually in concert with somebody else. So it's either, the young people are more susceptible to peer pressure, and so it's either in a group of young people or with an adult. And I think in the film they bring up the fact that the majority, in Florida, the majority of the cases where young people who were convicted as adults were involved, there was an adult co-defendant. And so you see that in the film, and I think it's, we're talking about the Supreme Court decisions. The Supreme Court, in their decisions, really looked at the research on brain development and brain science, and they recognize that young people's brains are still developing up until mid-20s, and the part of the brain that's still developing is that part around your behavior control, your decision making, your ability to control your impulses. And so young people are much more impressionable and much more susceptible to the influences of adults. And that's what you see in this film, and you see that in most cases where young people are facing these very harsh sentences.
Initially, Kenneth was sentenced to life in prison. What happened to Bethea, the adult? What kind of sentence did he get? I assume he was convicted.
He was. He also got a life without parole sentence, but whereas Kenneth got 4 consecutive life without parole sentences, Bethea got 1. And actually we see that around the country, that oftentimes the juveniles are punished much more harshly than the adults who they committed the crimes with.
All right, I was struck by that in the documentary. Mishi, give me a rationale for that. But why should there be any circumstances in which a juvenile would get a harsher sentence for the same crime than an adult?
I honestly can't give you a rationale for it because it doesn't make any sense to me, and I'm not exactly sure what the sentencing court was thinking when they handed down 4 consecutive life sentences,
right.
Whereas the co-defendant got 1 life sentence. So actually it's not something I can explain. I know that it's very common, but I'm not sure what the rationale
Right.
is.
Now, there is a very clear racial and ethnic component to the sentences that are handed down, actually throughout the criminal justice system, but in this case specifically with regard to juveniles. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of research to show that young people of color are treated more harshly at every stage of the criminal justice and the juvenile justice system. And so as young people move through the system, you see more harsher penalties for young people of color than for white youth, even youth who are facing the same crimes, who are being charged with the same crimes. And so with African American youth, they make up, African American youth make up probably like 12% of the US population, but they're over 40% of young people incarcerated in juvenile facilities. But then when you look at young people who are convicted as adults and facing, or who are serving life without parole sentences, it's over 60% of African American youth are serving 60% of all cases. And so you see that, this sort of, the harsher treatment of young people of color just becoming just worse as young people move through the system. And it's an issue that people around the country have recognized, and even the federal government has recognized, but these disparities continue to exist and actually have worsened over the years.
An especially interesting part of the film, I thought, was the attention you paid to Kenneth's home life, which was terrible, and terrible might even be an understatement. You spent a fair amount of time talking with his mother and following her explain what his childhood was like and what his mother was like.
Mm-hmm. Kenneth grew up with a single mother who had a crack addiction for 19 years. So from the time he was a toddler, his mother was addicted to crack. She would often leave him alone. He didn't have really any guidance. He dropped out of school when he was 11 years old to take care of his sister, had 2 children at the age of 15. So he grew up quickly, and he lived in an environment a neighborhood that was high unemployment, a lot of poverty, a lot of crime, robberies. So he didn't have guidance, he didn't have supervision, and he was easily targeted by people like Bethea.
He actually talked about riding his bike around the neighborhood as a youngster, going from, I guess, one crack house to another, trying to persuade his mother to come home and take a shower, or maybe get something to eat. I mean, it sounded pretty awful.
He was the parent, essentially.
Right. So the arc of the film actually takes us through the hearing process because he had to be resentenced because it was no longer legal to have this life without parole sentence. Now, we also heard from victims in the film, and there was at least one victim, and maybe more than one, that was not interested in any leniency being shown to him. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Mm-hmm. Well, I wanted, through the film, people to be able to see both perspectives, both Kenneth's and the victims. And so there are 3 victims in the film, and they all have a different reaction to their experience. The one that really did not want to see Kenneth out had actually never testified at the original trials. And so this was her first time testifying, and 11.5 years later, she was still very angry about what had happened. And so she just didn't think that Kenneth should be in the same neighborhood as her. She said she wouldn't feel safe walking around, and wasn't willing to look at who he was now. It was as though it was 11.5 years earlier.
Right. Now, an especially moving moment in the film was one of the other victims. This woman was held up, I guess it was at gunpoint, but then at one point she said that Bethea threatened to rape her, and Kenneth intervened. Talk about that.
Mm-hmm. That was Jennifer Norman who gave that interview, and she's a Canadian who was working in Tampa at the time. And she really describes Kenneth as somebody who was just there by association. You know, he wasn't responsible, he didn't touch her, he didn't touch the money, he never came over the counter. By her accounts, he was just really a bystander.
Was he armed?
No,
Okay.
not in her testimony,
Right.
not from what she told police and not what she told me. So she really saw Kenneth as sort of a victim of circumstance in a way. And she also wrote to him after the incident because she wanted to let him know what that had done to her, and also to tell him that, you know, to thank him for intervening.
And what did she say actually happened?
She said the 2 of them came into first they cased it, they left, they came back into the establishment about 15 minutes later. Bethea jumped over the counter, grabbed her ponytail, told her to open the cash register, which she did, then wanted her to open the safe, which she didn't have the number to, and then took her into a back room and was threatening to rape her.
And Kenneth did what?
Kenneth walked into the back room, or at least the door of that room, and said, you can't do that, we have to leave.
And Bethea then did leave?
After pushing her to the ground, yes, they left.
The judge ended up coming down pretty hard on Kenneth. He didn't give the maximum possible sentence, but he didn't seem very merciful at all. So what was the final sentence that Kenneth received?
Kenneth received a 30-year sentence with 10 years probation.
After following this case all the way through, were you surprised at that sentence, or had you anticipated it?
No, I really thought he had an opportunity to be released.
Mish, you as well, did you think that in a case like that, given the good behavior of the defendant?
I did, but then I knew it was Florida. And Florida is the state in the country that has sentenced the most young people to life without parole sentences. It's also the state that charges the most young people with adult convictions, and has the most young people in adult jails and prisons. And so Florida really is kind of the belly of the beast when you're talking about these issues. And so knowing that it was Florida, I was watching this kind of hoping that this judge would be an exception, but unfortunately it seems like he kind of acted how many judges in Florida act.
It really is so dependent on the judge, because one of the other judges that's in the film, Patrice Moore, who's an African-American woman, was actually one of Kenneth's public defenders at his original trials. Now she's a juvenile court judge, but when we interviewed her, she said that if Kenneth had come to their county first, Pinellas, just one county over, he would have received likely a plea bargain and a much lighter sentence. And in fact, when he was sentenced for the crime in Pinellas, unfortunately it was the 4th trial, he was given 7 years.
Right. Mishi, you pointed out that the news on the criminal justice front, as far as juveniles are concerned, is not by any means all bad. What's going on there? What are some of the good things that are occurring?
There's actually, there is a lot of good news around juvenile justice in terms of youth incarceration. So over the last 15 years, there's been a pretty dramatic decrease in the number of young people who are incarcerated across the country, and so it's decreased by almost half between '97 and 2011, and almost all states have had decreases. There's just a very small handful of states that have had increase in the number of young people incarcerated, and that's largely due to policy changes on this, in state legislatures, where states have created community-based alternatives to incarceration for young people, usually young people convicted or charged with nonviolent offenses, but recognizing that young people do best in their communities with their families, and that those families and communities need support. And so a lot of states have started redirecting all of their resources from youth prisons back into community programs. And so we've seen a decrease across the country. And also the good news is there's been fewer young people in adult prisons and jails. And even in states like Florida, we've seen a decrease. And some states are starting now to turn back a lot of the very punitive legislation that was passed in the 90s to try young people as adults, to treat young people the same as adults. And so we see less and less young people being prosecuted as adults. We finally, with the Supreme Court decisions, there's a recognition that young people are different than adults. And so there has been a lot of progress around these issues.
Now, Nadine, you're a Canadian journalist, and after taking this close-up look at the juvenile justice system in the United States, what's your overall impression, and what, if anything, surprised you?
I was surprised right from the beginning when I found out there were juvenile life without parole sentences, because we don't have anything that even approaches that in Canada. In fact, a youth in Canada who commits first-degree murder, it's not unusual for them to get a 10-year sentence and eligible for parole in 7 years. And it's kept within the juvenile system, so they actually serve out their sentence within a juvenile detention rather than being passed into an adult prison system. So it's very different. And what I find interesting, and what really drew me to this story, is the fact that it's really moving in the other direction now in the United States. And so
it's moving in a more positive direction in the U.S.
Yeah, moving away from that, where in Canada we're actually going in the opposite direction. We're following down your footsteps maybe a decade ago. We're just starting that in the last couple of years with the federal government that we have in place now. They're making it easier to send children to prison for longer.
With Kenneth, assuming he continues with his good behavior, how old will he be when he's finally released?
45.
45. And he's how old now?
He's 29.
Right. This is a question to both of you. If you could sort of wave a magic wand and come up with the juvenile justice system that you think would work best, what would it look like? We've only got a minute left, but Mishi first, and then Nadine.
So I think it would be a system where we don't send young people even to court or to facilities, that we have the supports and services that they need in the communities where they live. And so it's really about connecting young people to positive youth development opportunities in their neighborhoods and supporting their families. Often families are struggling. So it's giving the families the support that they need to keep young people at home, and it's really about investing in the future of young people.
Nadine?
For 10 years, we were doing that in Canada. There were a lot of diversion programs. Police were actually dissuaded from charging. They were more encouraged to give fines, warnings. And we saw a marked decrease in youth crime in Canada because of those policies.
Thank you both. I wish we had more time. This has been terrific. 15 to Life, Kenneth's story, will be shown on PBS's POV series beginning August 4th. Check your local listings. I'll be back in a moment with a final word. I keep hearing that Hillary Clinton is a lock for the Democratic nomination in 2016. Don't you believe it. She may or may not win that nomination, but it is anything but a sure thing. One quick scenario, she loses the Iowa caucuses and does poorly right after that in the New Hampshire primary against Senator Bernie Sanders from neighboring Vermont, who is threatening a challenge from Clinton's left. If that were to happen, the press would go crazy with stories about the breakdown of the Hillary juggernaut. We've had a number of modern examples of extreme long shots winning not just their party's nomination, but the presidency. Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton come to mind. The last time an all but certain frontrunner was upended by a challenger who came out of nowhere, that frontrunner was none other than Hillary Clinton herself. The challenger was Barack Obama. That's all for now. See you next time.